This is Ashley Croft. Thank you for joining me for this year's 2022-2023 WiDA ELL Standards presentation. If you have any questions for me at all after this, please feel free to email me at ashley.croft@knoxschools.org. And our agenda is to just kind of get a general overview of the WiDA standards and also connect you to the elevation overview and any thing you're going to need to know for your ELL students this year. WiDA stands for the World Class Instructional Design and Assessment. And our beliefs as a department align to these in that our students, multilingual learners, deserve equitable access to the curriculum and instruction and assessments, as well as access to RTI and gifted and talented programs and all of the other programs that our school offers. Our research shows that multilingual learners are best served when they can learn content and language together at the same time, which is why I love our new benchmark curriculum, because it has an ELL piece for English language development that comes alongside the ELA text that you have in your classroom. These are the states that are part of the WiDA consortium, so almost all of them, and you can see Tennessee's on the list. And if students come from any of these states, we should expect WiDA scores and information for them in their CRs. We are currently in year 2 of the WiDA Standards 3-year plan. Last year we just started building awareness about what it even means and what it is. And this year it's more moving into collaborating with the ELA department and being more intentional in the way we do that. Okay, so this says right here, potential uses of the WiDA ELD standards framework. And if you look at just the teachers box for a second, take a look at that and read through the bullet points, please. And as you can see, teachers, and that includes content teachers as well as the ELL teachers, we are going to be collaborating and modeling to provide students with access to the content together, and also provide feedback to them and their families. And there are multiple ways we can collaborate, whether it is online through the elevation forums, or whether I am touching base with you as I pull students out of the classroom, push into your classroom. You know, I'm very flexible about the way I deliver service, and it really depends on what you believe students need in the moment and during certain seasons of the school year. Now take a look at the second half of this slide, students, families, and communities. And it just is saying that our students, their families, our community, it's going to benefit from, intentional goals that focus on promoting equity for all. Okay, so now looking at this slide, we have on the left what the framework is and what it's not. And so if you look at the left side, there are clear and measurable goals, and the language expectations are going to be something that I provide to you. I create ILPs every year for my English learners. This stands for Individual Learning Plan. And it's going to be based on the students' scores that they got from their WiDA test in the spring of the previous school year. So it'll tell you what you can expect from each child in your room, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so the listening and reading is the interpretive mode of communication, and of course the speaking and writing is the expressive mode. And so you'll see what you can expect from them at the level that they scored at in the spring, and it'll also show you what they're reaching for. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, notice that this is not something to be used in isolation. This just kind of comes alongside what you do and all your best practices that you implement in your classroom for all learners. Okay, so the big ideas of the WiDA framework are equity. There's gonna be more on these, so I'm gonna go through this quickly. Equity, integration, collaboration, and a functional approach to language development. Okay, so here's the first one, equity. And, it mentions here that students are going to bring their own personal background knowledge, way of learning, cultural connections. And, just like all your students, this is important to know that students bring a lot of history and schema with them. And so celebrating that and promoting that in the classroom, I think, is really good. I recommend doing it in a way that it doesn't always call it out, just because sometimes that can make students nervous, and their affective filter will shoot up. But if you notice an excitement about something that they're connecting to, that is, just like all your other students, a really powerful tool. The next big idea is integration of content and language. And this, once again, is the idea that vocabulary and content and language, it's all learned together. And students do not learn language in isolation. They don't learn it out of context. So the more that they can learn in the moment with their text, with the interaction with their classmates, with the realia, or like hands-on things that we bring, the concrete things that we can bring to make the abstract concrete in the room, that's going to help them learn exponentially more quickly. Okay, big idea 3 is collaboration among stakeholders. And so stakeholders start at the building level. We have so many families that are just an absolute treasure to this community. And I love having those connections. I love seeing my classroom teachers make connections with all of their families, go into certain, if a family owns a restaurant, they go visit. And, there's just so many different ways to do that. But also, the big idea kind of stretches beyond this school community and into our legal system in the state. Finally, big idea 4 is the functional approach to language development. So language is dynamic, and once again, this kind of goes back to the idea of learning language in context, and also just, I would feel like this is a really great place to interject that idea once again of using all of your resources that you already have, that you use with all your students, but just applying an extra layer to our English learners. The more you can provide visual support and wait time, the more that you can kind of notice in the moment those teachable moments for students to kind of reinforce language that they're learning. I know at the beginning of the year you're doing a lot of routine, classroom routines, academic routines, behavior practice routines. Just the repetition of key words for students is going to be really key, and just connecting to those connecting to those in the context of each content area, and each little microcosm is going to help our students. Okay, so as you can see, these big ideas are kind of connecting to a larger framework. So if you look in the middle of this diagram here, the proficiency level descriptors, those are the things that I told you the students will have in their ILPs. It's going to tell you what you can expect them to have, but it is on a continuum. And then the language expectations are goals for content-driven language learning. That's kind of where they're going. And I'm always going to do the Vygotsky +1, I +1. Where am I and where am I reaching for the next level? Key language uses, that's the green box there. Prominent language uses across disciplines. So students are going to need to know really key words, like if we could kind of boil it down to the most important thing in the most important language. And once again, that's why I like our ELL piece of the ELA curriculum, is because the kind of that idea of the 10 important sentences, like the most important actual grade level content is taken from your ELA text, and it's put in the books that I have, but with more visual support. And then finally, the WiDA ELD standard statements. Those are the big picture, and so that is the conceptual framing of language and content. And those standards are so simple. I I think they're going to be on another slide, but they are just like the language of instruction, the language of, social. And then there's the language of English language arts, and the language of math, the language of social studies, the language of science. And those sound really big, which is why we have to bring it down to the details, as you see, going back down to proficiency level descriptors and like what does that look like on a day-to-day basis for each child. Okay, so there they are. This ELD standards, WiDA ELD standards are, number one is always the social and instructional. So think about the BICs and the CALPs. And then standard 2 is always, and this is in alphabetical order after number 1, so like all the content areas. First is language arts, standard 3 is math, standard 4 is science, and standard 5 is social studies. And part of the reason we give this training is because we are told that if an auditor came to our school and asked you what are the WiDA ELD standards, you'd be able to tell them. And it seems silly to say, well, the standard is the language of math, the language of science, but that's what they are. And once again, they are very broad, but they are made concrete and more accessible to us to understand what to do with them by the proficiency descriptors. Okay, so as you can see, standard 1 applies to all the other standards because of the instructional language that's connected to all the content areas. Okay. Now, key language uses. This is kind of where it gets more real life. And if you notice at the top of this slide, it says that key language uses, things like narrating, informing, explaining, and arguing, those are the prominent ways that language is used in school. So students might need to narrate a personal story or write a paragraph informing about the life cycle of an oak tree. They might be able to write or speak to explain a procedure, like how to, I know sometimes you start with something simple like how to make a sandwich, but it can move forward into other scientific processes like how to make an observation and document. There's also, opinion paragraphs and opinion essays, and so students are made to argue their opinions and their viewpoints. So all of these things I know you see in your writing, even from a young grade level all the way up through 5th grade. Okay. So language expectations. So these are goals for content-driven language learning. And so basically you're going to recognize the it looks kind of like our Tennessee state standards, but it has the ELD at the beginning, and then the LA stands for language arts. That's an example of what a language standard looks like. Okay. And you can see on this piece of paper here that this is an example of the WiDA ELD Standard 2, which is the one that's the language of language arts. And you can see here that there are examples or examples of like language resources or things that they can use to kind of apply this to something specific. Okay, here's an example of an annotated text, and this is showing students having a chance to, I believe it is, argue, or is it inform? Yeah. So it says right here, I will share several reasons to support my position, on this issue. So this is an example of a student getting to write something to argue. And yeah, moving on. Okay. This is an example of what the proficiency level descriptors would look like. Now this is for listening and reading and viewing. So this is the interpretive or kind of incoming language processing. And if you see that at the top of the box there, this says end of level 1, end of level 2. So if a student comes to you with kind of like say that you have a student who comes to you and they're like a 3.4. So that means that by the end of level 3, they should be able to do the things in that column. And then, of course, reaching for level 4 is what we're going to do. Hopefully, we're going to work for that throughout this school year. Okay, so using the WiDA standards, you are not required to write these in your lesson plans, but if you wanted to, it's telling you that you could select a content standard and then select a key language use. Okay, so it's kind of like a what are students learning, and I feel like the ELL piece would kind of be the how are they going to demonstrate their learning of the standard, their success with the standard. Also, language expectations are going to be boiled down to that kind of individualized student level of where they are and what they can do now and what they're reaching for. And of course, as usual, we need to be specific with our standards and our lesson planning. And of course, scaffolding is important because our students with lower language levels are not going to be able to produce the same amount of expressive language, whether speaking or writing. They might not be able to receive and get the input of all the language if they hear, your lesson. If they don't have a lot of visual support, they're going to need more. They're going to need more wait time for their answer. They're going to need to practice with peers before they share out to the class. I have so many different awesome strategies for that, and if you need help with that, please reach out. Okay, so now elevation. If you have a student that needs to be monitored and you've never had one before, you will get an email before the first monitoring form is due, and they'll ask you to create an account. If you already have an account, it should be the same login, and you'll get an email letting you know that the first monitoring form has been put online. And so I think the first monitoring form is due in October, and I will also reach out to anyone who needs to monitor students. Students who need to be monitored are transition kids that exited the program, and only for the first 2 years. So T1s and T2s. And we have, I believe, 4 T1s at Ritta this year. And so when you log in, you're going to see how many students in your class are ELLs and how many need to be monitored. And you'll get to see some of that data with language and all of that. It'll also show you their composite level, which is kind of like their overall score on WiDA. And I always like to remind people that like a level 1 is like a beginner, like a student who just maybe moved here, kind of like a newcomer, or a student who's, just really still developing that language. They might still be in the silent phase, and they might just be like really listening and kind of just taking in everything. And then students who are like a level 5 and 6 are more like comparable to their English native speaking peers. Okay, this is an example of what the access scores look like on a graph. And if you look on the right hand side, students listening often is quite high. A lot of my students have a 6 in listening, but then like their writing might be the lowest thing, and it drags down their score. So just be aware that your student might be a 6 in listening, but there might still be a 2 in writing. And so if you have a student who is a 6 in listening, if you see on this screen, it'll show you that they've achieved English proficiency in this domain, so that you should expect them to be just like everyone else in their class when they're listening to instruction and directions. But notice on this slide also that reading is only a 2.6. So this student on the left-hand side column, what you can expect them to do is be able to search for pictures associated with word patterns, identify and interpret pre-taught labeled diagrams, match voice to print by pointing to icons, letters. You can see how very basic this is compared to a level 6, but that's where they are, and that's what you can expect them to be able to do without much help. But notice to the right, they're reaching for a level 3, and so they're moving towards making text-to-self connections with prompting, selecting titles to match a series of pictures, sorting illustrated content words into categories, and matching phrases and sentences to pictures. Okay, students who are in grades 3 through 5 will have TCAP, TN Ready accommodations, you and I must collaborate on this decision. And so, as you get to know your students, if you see something that they are using on a regular basis, something that you think they will need for the TCAP, we need to document that we talked about it and that it has been given to them throughout the school year as much as possible. So if that means students get read aloud, even on your weekly tests, that will set them up for success to get read aloud on the TCAP tests. And that can be for all the content areas, or it can be for just the ones they need. Maybe they don't need it for math, but maybe they need it for, the other three, language, arts, science, and social studies. So we're going to kind of stay in contact about that all year. I'm trying to think what else is available. We've got small group, rest and breaks. And I think the big one really is the read aloud. And of course, if we have students that are literate in their first language, they are eligible for a one-to-one bilingual dictionary. But not all of our students are literate in their first language, so it really just is only appropriate to each individual student. And that's why we will work together to determine those accommodations for the test this year. Every student, K through 5, will get instructional accommodations. I will be updating these in Elevation, and they will be part of the student's ILP, individual learning plan. One of the ones I always put on here is wait time, because it's so important to give students time to think before they have to answer. I even often ask the question before calling on students, which a lot of us use fairness cups in our room, so that's perfect for that. So what I'll do is I'll ask the question and have students think about it, maybe even share with a partner first, so that everyone is accountable for the answer and everyone gets a chance to think through their answer. Then I draw the name, so that when a student who maybe isn't quite, ready to share in front of the class, if I draw their name after they've had time to think, they're so much more likely to be ready to share and to not have their affective filter pop up. Another one I often put on here, and I encourage everyone to please consider, is to use as much visual support as you can. And that isn't always like you trying to find pictures. That can also be hand gestures, facial expressions, acting things out. The more we can make the abstract concrete for our students, the more everyone, including all of your students, is going to learn. I am personally committed to working on bringing in more realia this year. So I want to find real objects my students can touch and interact with, so that they can learn the vocabulary for their texts this year in a very meaningful way. Because as we can create an experience for our students, the more it's going to just be learning that sticks. Okay. I mentioned the monitoring forms. The form is super, super easy. And it says right here that these forms will go out at the end of the first, second, and third quarters every 9 weeks. And so you will get an email reminder from Elevation. And, if you have any questions on how to do this, I'm happy to help. It's super fast and easy. And the main thing is it's wanting to know, is the student doing okay academically? And if not, do you think it's because of language needs, like English proficiency, needs, or do you think it's because of something else like attendance or behavior? And so if you need more ELL support for a student who is not, they're monitored, so it's going to be transition kids or waiver kids. They don't see me daily, but if you need me to come in and give more support, you can note that. And if not, you can just say, continue as it is. And once again, I can help you with this if you need help. Okay, so that is it for this year. Thank you so much. There will be a link sent out to you so that you can fill out a Google form that basically affirms that you were given this training for this year. Thank you so much.